Let me just start this video by saying I love Undermine. It's my favorite World of Warcraft patch of all time. It's reminded me why I've always loved goblins. I think by and large the story for Undermine has been great as well, even despite peculiarities here and there, like Renzik not getting a voice, or the fact that the campaign came to an abrupt week-long halt as Renzik tried to talk Gazlowe into staying in Undermine, suggesting not only that the conversation went nowhere for an entire week, because by the time we could carry it on again, Renzik still hadn't convinced Gazlowe, but also that these characters stood outside talking for a straight week while being fully aware that Gazlowe had employed a sniper. In fact, the first thing that happened when the questline restarted again was Nikki the Fixer attempting to assassinate Gazlowe but killing Renzik instead. The fact that Nikki still failed to land a shot on Gazlowe suggests she was honestly really terrible at her job. Almost as terrible as the Secret Service agent who doesn't think to maybe make sure to keep the important political figures he knows indoors when snipers are about. Sorry, I just think the way that all ended up working is really funny. But little things like that aside, I really think Undermine's storytelling has been some of the best we've gotten in a patch so far. I've always loved the goblins, so the whole thing is like catnip for me, but even if you've always dismissed them as comic relief, this is the patch that humanizes goblins in a way that we've never really seen before. As a race, goblins have been dealt a raw deal. Goblin players literally start out being told their new faction leader is the guy who stole all their money and enslaved their friends. A certain amount of justice for goblins has been a long time coming. So getting to stand by the goblins of Undermine as they revolt against oppression before taking down Gazlowe himself has been very satisfying. And I know, not for anyone interested in mythic raiding or the world first race, but for those of us who are quite satisfied with defeating Gazlowe on an easier difficulty while he called us little jerks, very satisfying.
Get up and dance for me, you little jerks!
I've enjoyed spending time with the different cartels. It's been great to see what some of the oldest recognizable goblin characters like Baron Revelgaz and Marin Noggenfogger have been up to these days. The twists and turns in Undermine's story involving Xalatath, the Ethereals, Khajiit, and the Dark Heart have also all been both surprising and welcome. A lot of really important stuff has gone down that's planting the seeds for, I suspect, some pretty cataclysmic events later. In fact, you can watch some of my theories in a new Taliesin and Evertal video I helped co-write the script for. I also just really love Nanny Tallulah. I mean, she calls me Dollface and told me I'm on the top of her Rolodex.
Honey, sweetie, baby, sugar plum angel face. Thanks for completing that job. My pocketbook thanks you too.
I would die for her. But there's one thing about this story, especially something about Renzik's position in the story, that I've really tried not to let bother me, but that I just can't shake. And the more I think about it as well, the more I realize it's not just one simple thing. I can't just say I don't like Renzik in the Undermine story because that would just be flat out wrong. I've never mained an alliance or a rogue, so Renzik isn't a character I knew too well before this patch started, but getting to know him has been a real treat. Even without voice acting, his scenes have been some of the best scenes in the whole patch. Renzik's short story, The Tipping Point, is also just fantastic. It was written by Andrew Robinson, who also wrote The Goblin Way, Gazlowe's short story, and who's fast becoming one of my favorite World of Warcraft writers. But, cards on the table, it bothers me that Renzik, an Alliance character, gets to be the moral voice of reason who sets Gazlowe, a Horde character, on the right path. And this really wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for two things. An ongoing trend suggesting a very specific type of Alliance bias, and the way this bias may be leading to decision making that can actively undermine, the characters of the Horde. Oh gosh, and again, I just want to make it very clear, I am not violently pro-Horde or anti-Alliance by any means. I play both factions, and have favorite and least favorite characters on both sides. And I'm also not someone who's about to claim bad writing, because I don't believe that at all. If I'm being honest, sometimes I think accusations of bad writing are more about insecurity than anything else. Because if someone doesn't like something that's well written, then they might have bad taste. But if they don't like something that was badly written, well then, their dislike for the thing actually means they're intellectually and probably morally superior as well. With all that said, and more for my own sake than anything else, I want to unpack what exactly it is about Renzik's placement in Undermine's story that couldn't help but rub me the wrong way. Is it just me? Am I being too sensitive? Is there a deeper problem here? I'd like to invite you to join me as I try to figure this out. So, the basic story of Undermine is that ever since Gazlowe moved back in and took over, things have been worse than usual, and things weren't even that good to begin with. Gazlowe has always been an oppressive leader, so when we get to Undermine ourselves, it's partly in response to a distress call. A venture company goblin named Pamsy blew up a war that opened the way from Undermine's mining operations to the Ringing Deeps, because she hoped that someone, anyone, would notice and come do something.
Look, this project is slowly killing my crew. Blowing up the wall was my cry for help.
From the start, Gazlowe makes it pretty clear he doesn't want to go to Undermine. He doesn't like Undermine, he left it for a reason. Renzik is the one who constantly tries to convince him Undermine isn't so bad, and also that it really needs our help. They have several conversations about it. Gazlowe cannot be trusted with something like black blood. It looks like we got business in Undermine.
You got business in Undermine. I ain't ever going back there.
I thought you were the one who wanted to build a better world for goblins.
Any goblin who wants a better world has already left Undermine, like we did. Look, maybe we can get some others out.
It's their home. They shouldn't have to leave. I gave up everything when I left. Family, friends. I won't make anyone else do that.
All right. We'll take a look around.
And right away, this is a little weird, because this isn't the impression we got from Gazlowe before, not when it was Gazlowe leading the story. During a local quest in Azkahet, the one that first really hinted we'd be seeing Undermine this expansion, Gazlowe is extremely interested when he comes across venture company goblins from Undermine. The venture company don't have the best history, they've often been our enemies, but Gazlowe specifically decides to take a diplomatic approach with these ones because of the fact that they mentioned Undermine. I want to hear more about where you're from. You mean Undermine? Sure, I'm in. We'll need to be careful with the venture company, but there's no need to fight them while we're here on other business, particularly when they mention Undermine in casual conversation. That warrants further chat. At no point does this sound like Gazlowe hates Undermine and never wants to go back there. In fact, it sounds like he's so interested in Undermine, he's willing to put aside any difference he might have with other goblins just because they might tell him more about it. That's bordering on enthusiasm. But by the time the Undermine patch starts, all we really hear from Gazlowe is how much he's not interested in going there, and once he is there, how much he wants to leave. It's a little odd.
Undermine smells worse than I remember. Was it always this suffocating?
Come on now. Old grease and burnt rubber, the smells of home.
This ain't my home. Not anymore. Oh, it's good to finally get out of there.
Again with Undermine? What's your problem?
Really? You gotta ask?
In his short story, The Goblin Way, Gazlowe visits Marin Noggenfogger specifically to convince Marin to run a more ethical business. Gazlowe makes it clear that he's taken the cause of all his people to heart. Not just the Bilgewater, but goblins as a race in general. I know what you're trying to sell me here, and I'm not buying it, Gazlowe said, climbing over a collapsed pipe. What I'm seeing is your people are overworked and underpaid. Your engineers and tinkers ain't motivated. Your machines ain't getting maintained properly, and that's dangerous. I want all of us, Gazlowe waved his hand to indicate all goblins in general, to be proud of being goblins. I want us to be proud of what we can build, and I want the Horde to be proud to be associated with us. But again, by the time of Undermine, Gazlowe seems pretty willing to leave the goblins of the biggest city where goblins live out of his plan for a better future for goblins. Renzik even calls him out on it, and Gazlowe only brushes Renzik's objections aside with a weak, yeah well, not them. It's just odd. It doesn't quite fit with what we know about Gazlowe so far, or even how he was being set up immediately before this patch. Instead, it feels a little bit like Gazlowe's story was subtly rewritten here, specifically to make space for another character, namely Renzik. But it does allow Renzik to convince Gazlowe of the need to help those in Undermine, and when Renzik dies to protect Gazlowe, that only makes his message all the more powerful. And it probably makes for a better story than Gazlowe just heading into Undermine himself with a hero complex, no persuasion needed, so I do get it. But of all the characters they could have chosen to fulfill this role in Undermine, did they really have to choose the Alliance Goblin? To segue a minute, I've played through Undermine on a Goblin. In fact, I dusted off Blood Bubbles, my original first real main, just for this patch because, I mean, you have to, right? And for the most part, playing a Goblin this patch has been filled with a lot of great little extras specifically for Goblins, from unique dialogue options to the chance to catch up with your old friends from Kazan. I did find it a bit strange that Katie Racketring, the cartel recruiter, makes a point of reassuring me the Bilgewater and Undermine aren't part of the Horde. Officially, they're part of the Horde, but don't let that scare you off. This is Undermine. The jobs here are all about Undermine business. Why would that scare me off, Katie? I'm a Goblin from the Horde. It's just tiny things like this, nothing huge, but like little paper cuts that have me asking, why does Undermine need what feels like so much reassurance designed to make the Alliance comfortable, especially considering everything so far in the War Within? To return to the choice of Renzik, there were Horde Goblins who could have been chosen for this role. Apart from the Goblins who we do see in Undermine, there's one particular Goblin who I can't help but feel actually deserved this role. One Goblin who's been noticeably missing from this patch, leaving me with one question on my mind. Where the hell is Boss Mida? The Trade Princess movement was a player movement back during Cataclysm. Basically, nobody wanted Gallywix for Trade Prince because, obviously, why would we? And instead, players came up with their own alternative character who should take the role. Trade Princess Mida Silvertongue, also nicknamed Hurtornus. Yeah, the Invaderism reference there does kind of show how long ago this whole thing went down, but the point is, Mida was actually eventually added to the game as an NPC in Orgrimmar named Boss Mida. She was even given a taller model, along with the title of Hurtornus. While sometimes an NPC might be added as a joke or a reference, existing only to stand in one spot before being largely forgotten, Mida has very occasionally played a role in the game since. She was even a quest giver during Battle for Azeroth's war campaign. So here's a character that was introduced literally as the alternative to Gallywix, or at least as a symbol of resistance against Gallywix, and the player's own choice for who was wanted instead. And in the patch where we directly revolt against Gallywix's leadership, Mida is nowhere to be seen. And then, for good measure, the story of Undermine wraps up with us all visiting Westfall with Matthias Shaw, leader of Stormwind's SI-7, the Alliance Secret Service. As a Horde Goblin in the Goblin Zone, that felt a bit like it was supposed to be a slightly more Horde-focused patch after a frankly Alliance-heavy expansion opening. I'm wrapping up the story in the Alliance Zone with an important Alliance character. Oh, and then we get this remarkable exchange.
Hey, Shaw. You ever need anything? I owe you one.
That's a dangerous thing to say to the Spy Master of Stormwind.
Life's a dangerous business.
That is the leader of my Horde race in my Horde faction telling the head of the Alliance secret police that he owes him a favor. Shaw, quite accurately, warns him how dangerous that promise is to make, and Gazlowe just sort of brushes it off. Both characters completely ignored my screaming at this point. As always, my own character is as voiceless as Renzik. So to recap, Undermine is so concerned with making sure Alliance players don't feel uncomfortable with being associated with the Horde, it even reminds Horde players not to be scared off by the Goblin Horde Association. The main story includes more than one Alliance character and even ends with visiting an Alliance zone. It positions an Alliance character as one of the most important main characters of the story, and in a way that may have undermined Horde Goblin characters, with Gazlowe's character slightly altered and Mida's character removed completely. And okay, maybe that isn't fair. Maybe they just didn't consider Mida. Maybe the thought of giving her Renzik's role never even occurred to them. But isn't that worse? The fact that the writers reached for an Alliance character while seemingly forgetting to include the Horde character whose literal entire history is wrapped up in exactly the story this patch is meant to be telling. Boss Mida and the Horde players who care about her really deserve better than that. But is it proof of Alliance bias in the War Within? A while ago, I co-wrote a script with Taliesin and Evertel about whether or not the War Within story is biased towards one faction.
Are the Horde losing the War Within? Is the War Within basically an Alliance story with some Horde representation slapped on just for the sake of it?
Our conclusion was that yes, from the cover art to the characters who play a major role in the main leveling campaign, Alliance representation got a strong start to say the least. While we acknowledge there was often good reason for many of the choices, covering the story of characters like Anduin, Ilaria, Moira, and Magni all made sense in the context of what's been happening in this expansion, and I stand by that, we also noticed how this ended up meaning the Alliance dominating most zone storylines, or how sometimes an Alliance pick was chosen even when a neutral or Horde character could have worked, like our Delve companion being Bran. And it goes without saying, no one ever took the time to reassure me that working with any of these characters wasn't the same thing as working for the Alliance. Even when you're spending a significant amount of time with the actual High King of the Alliance, yeah, I know he's not the High King anymore. Everyone knows he's the once and future king, he's just taking a minute. No one's stopping to let you know not to be frightened off by that. And, you know, I could use a little reassurance, because what we have been getting is references to a great battle between the light and the darkness, the same prophecy that Velen once had about Anduin, which, incidentally, included a prophecy of Anduin leading both the Alliance and the Horde. So some reassurance there for us Horde players wouldn't have been unwelcome. But the War Within has had some Horde representation, even before Undermine, I mean. Like Gazlowe, Thrall, and Lilian Voss. Of those three, only Gazlowe's was really good representation, with quests showing his care for all goblins and interest in Undermine. So, representation that has since been kinda butchered for the sake of Renzik, the Alliance Goblin. Thrall's role in the War Within so far has mostly been to dip in and out to remind us that the Horde are still present in this expansion, before mostly reverting to his fallback of emotional support orc for the Alliance king who's pretending he's not a king right now, Anduin. Which brings me to Lilian Voss. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again. Lilian Voss is a problem. Lilian has played more and more of a role recently as a major undead representative, and in a way that makes sense because she's a major character in a lot of undead storylines. But for most of her history, Lilian was specifically not part of the Horde, which in itself isn't necessarily an issue. After all, Gazlowe only recently became an official part of the Horde. But I would argue Gazlowe's earned his position in a way that Lilian, I'm afraid, has not. When Lilian was first introduced in Cataclysm, it was as a fresh undead, specifically one who really struggled to accept her fate, because in life she had been the daughter of a high priest of the Scarlet Crusade. Lilian rejects the offer to join the Forsaken and flees to her father, who immediately disowns her and orders her execution. Heartbroken, Lilian decides to take up revenge against the Scarlet Crusade instead, and for a long time, that was pretty much her entire motivation. She'd work with anyone, Alliance or Horde, who would help her with it. Lilian officially joined the Horde in Battle for Azeroth, where she finally showed up on the Horde's side. When asked about this, she explained part of her motivation was to help any newly risen Forsaken. It doesn't take a prophet to see that Sylvanas will use this war as a means of bringing more Forsaken into the world. My own conversion was difficult. I had a lot to work through, many scores to settle. I haven't let go of all that. But I also feel an obligation to help the newly risen adapt to their situation. Perhaps I can spare them the sort of pain I endured. Lilian also spoke about blaming the Alliance for the anti-Forsaken bias that she once harbored and felt the brunt of herself. In life, I was raised to hate the undead, trained to destroy them. When I became Forsaken, I hated myself most of all. But now I see it as the Alliance that fosters this malice. The human kingdoms shun their former brothers and sisters because we remind them what's lurking beneath the facade of flesh. It's time to end their cycle of hatred. The Alliance deserves to fall. I've always had a soft spot for Lilian. Her story is both tragic and, partly because she's one of those characters that one-shots every enemy for you, and partly because we get to see her kill her father, extremely satisfying. While I found it a little odd when she joined the Horde, her protective instincts towards the undead and outrage on their behalf at the prejudice they face echoed Sylvanas herself, the good side of Sylvanas, the dark lady that the Forsaken believed watched over them. It was promising. If only it lasted. Because Lilian has begun to really bother me. In fact, she outright angers me. When Kalia Menethil was introduced as a Forsaken leader, and believe me, we'll get to her in a moment, Lilian almost instantly seemed quite happy to be her very best friend in all the world. The two would attend Horde Council meetings together, and both are members of the Desolate Council. Kalia's presence there partly thanks to Lilian being willing to vouch for her. Kalia herself is a character I find particularly frustrating because she is interesting. An undead who is raised by the light can't help but raise a lot of questions. I actually want to see more of her. I think her character has so much potential and I will die on this hill. But she's being used in a way that's made her very unpopular, and for good reason. Kalia has been positioned as a major leader of the Forsaken, despite having no history with them and very little in common with them. For a moment, it even seemed like she was being prepared as a replacement for Sylvanas. A great deal was made of her being the heir to Lordaeron, and she was named the Pallid Lady, mirroring the Dark Lady, and was even issued her own loyal champion to mirror Sylvanas' Nathanos. While the Gilneas Reclamation questline was still on the PTR, a slip-up in the quest dialogue referred to Kalia as Queen Kalia. This was quickly fixed and was later revealed to be an unintentional mistake, but not before seriously worrying a lot of Forsaken players. After all, one reason to make a mistake like that is because, on some level, that's what you really think. The Reclamation of Gilneas questline was, of course, when Kalia and Lilian helped restore Gilneas to the Worgen, something that arguably benefits the Alliance at the cost of the Horde. One of the reasons why the Horde have attempted to take it before is because its position makes it a potential threat to the Horde if under Alliance control, and a lucrative resource if under Horde control. And yes, the Alliance and the Horde are good friends now, forgive and forget and all that, don't mention the war, and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. But the characters inside the story don't know Blizzard is moving away from a divided player base, so they have a lot less reason to just trust the Alliance than we do. On the whole, the Forsaken basically just giving Gilneas back to the Gilneans instead of taking it for themselves was always a strategically bizarre decision. When questioned about it, Lilian talks about wanting to get rid of the Scarlet Crusade on their doorstep, but again, handing it over to the Alliance instead is a strange choice. This questline also makes it clear Lilian no longer holds the Alliance accountable for the malice they foster against the Forsaken. And don't get me wrong, Lilian is still positioned by the narrative to stand protectively between the Forsaken and the Alliance who look down on them, but her stance has shifted. It's not defiant at all anymore. Rather, it's apologetic. When Gen is suspicious and angry towards the Forsaken, Lilian stands quietly by while Mia and Kalia reassures him that Kalia is not some mindless scourge. That Alliance attitude, that the Forsaken are the same thing as mindless scourge, is exactly the sort of prejudice Lilian once spoke about. But she makes no objections to this comment. What Lilian does take the time to do is tell us how much she likes her good friend Tess Greymane.
Need any daggers? I brought spares.
Thanks. Can never have enough. Need any poisons?
Couldn't hurt. Me at least.
I only hope that Tess continues to prove more diplomatic than her father.
I know her well. She cares far more about what people do than what they are.
During Dragonflight, Lilian helps out the Emerald Dream alongside Chandra's Feathermoon. Lilian faces a lot of anti-undead bias in the dream, and once again, she mostly just shrugs it off. If we speak to Lilian, she explains why she's working with Chandras. Why am I working with Chandris? What are you, an Undercity guard? Not all Forsaken agreed with Sylvanus' actions. We did not want Teldrassil to burn. We are not the monsters many think we are, and it's time more people knew that. Maybe this will help. For her part, Chandris has been patient and welcoming. It's an interesting change since Lilian explained why she was part of the Horde. She no longer seems angered by prejudice against the undead. Instead, she seems to expect it and believes the best way to combat it is to show people they're wrong. You could argue this is a more mature and effective approach, but I can't help finding it just a little depressing as well. Combined with the loss of Sylvanus, the Forsaken just don't seem to have anyone who's willing to be angry or defiant in the face of the prejudice they face anymore. Instead, Lilian just seems grateful when she doesn't experience outright hostility and resigned to accept it as a natural reaction when she does. During the questline, Chandris is infected by a dream spirit that causes her to attack Lilian, and once again, Lilian plays the role of good undead, ready to offer the Alliance character words of comfort and forgiveness. So to recap, Lilian is new to the Horde after resisting joining for many years. All her closest friends seem to either be Alliance or Alliance adjacent, and while she does genuinely appear to want to challenge prejudice against the undead, her approach mostly seems to be to let everyone know she is not offended by their bigotry and also forgives them. So this is the context where Lilian shows up in The War Within as one of the few Horde characters who play a role in this expansion's opening storyline, and she's introduced with an Alliance character, Alaria, insulting her. Fortunately, reinforcements have arrived with a capable spy master. Unfortunately, she is, well, you'll see. By this point, Lilian's entire thing seems to be to calmly take it while other creatures insult the undead. The questline even has a Nerubian calling her a monster. A Nerubian.
No. As you described it, she is but a shell of herself. It would have been better if they just killed her.
You're wrong.
Am I? One monster has sympathy for another.
True death is the end of the story. Anything before that is workable.
Time and time again, Lilian serves as a lesson to other characters who are prejudiced against the undead, but who learn to challenge their views once they see how much of a good undead she is. And she shows them she's a good undead by taking their insults and helping them with their goals. And this bothers me, partly because nobody should have to prove they're one of the good ones before they get the basic respect that other people get without jumping through hoops, but mostly because, well, Sylvanus put it best, to be honest. Sylvanus could barely contain her fury. How arrogant the living were. Of course the Forsaken existed only to enlighten them, allow them to feel good about themselves. They could go to sleep tonight with a clear conscience, knowing they were showing compassion and helping others. Sylvanus was strongly against the idea of the Forsaken existing only to enlighten others, but Lilian seems quite happy to be the positive lesson that exists to make others rethink their biases and grow as people. I just find that sad. But Renzik is also a support character, you're saying. He exists to teach Gazlowe a lesson, even dies for Gazlowe. And yes, you're right, but the difference is that Renzik has a lot more to him than that. The story of Undermine is, arguably, Renzik's story. We learn about Renzik's history, we spend time with his friends. Renzik's positioning in the story managed to take what should have been essentially a Horde storyline and turn it into something neutral that even leans a bit Alliance. He feels like a main character in a way that Lilian, so often playing the role of undead best friend, does not. Meanwhile, Boss Mida, who really should have finally gotten her chance to shine in this patch, lies forgotten in Orgrimmar. But don't worry, because we get to spend time with Matthias Shaw. And that, I think, is the crux of the issue. The Alliance has begun to feel like World of Warcraft's main character, the default, while the Horde is feeling more and more forgotten. Not necessarily in an overt way, but in a way that bleeds through subtly, like how if you subconsciously think of Kalia as the Queen of Lordaeron, you might accidentally call her that. That's why the Alliance characters are front and center. That's why even when a patch leans more Horde, there's a strong Alliance presence to the point where it almost begins to feel like an Alliance story. It's why when Horde characters do get representation, It just so happens to often be characters that already have a history of being friendly with the Alliance, that the Alliance are already comfortable with. Even when that means elevating characters who don't actually have a strong history with the Horde, like Lilian. Horde identity that's independent of the Alliance feels more and more like it's being eroded away, and with it already being confirmed that Alliance characters live in and can freely visit Silvermoon, I'm worried that won't improve in Midnight. But what do you think? If you enjoyed this video, you're welcome to like, subscribe, share, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, all that good YouTube stuff. There's also my Patreon where you can support the channel directly. So while that's all for now, hopefully I'll see you again soon.